we really encountered each other, I think, on Twitter for the first time.
Yeah.
I think you were arguing with John the Logician, or John the Hegelian, back it was called back then. And then uh, and then we ended up meeting at a liturgy show also, after we kind of talked a little bit on Twitter. And I thought it would be cool to have you on here. Do you want to, I don't often do this, but do you want to kind of just give a little introduction of how you'd like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I can say something. I'm so I'm an academic. I've been working on German idealism and Hegel for pretty close to decade and a half, uh, and also Marxism. By training, I'm a literature scholar, but most of my work these days is in philosophy. And I'm particularly interested in um, sort of uh, these days in debates surrounding the nature of Hegel's logic, what the book is even about, since that's still a very difficult question to answer, and the relationship between the idealist tradition, logic, and critical theory in the Marxist tradition. So very broadly, that's sort of my background and my set of interests.
Great. Um, well, yeah, thanks so much for coming on. I uh I jotted down a couple of like topics for us to discuss, most of which I think we uh talked about via DM, but I'm just gonna maybe list them all
Yeah,
first.
yeah,
Because I kind of want to be wide ranging, like I want to have some time talking about your specific work, and then also wider questions around philosophy online, and then of course the relationship of Hegel to Christianity and to occultism, basically.
right.
And as well as to Marxism. I actually watched your interview with Daniel Tutt, and learned a little more about your kind of critique of Zizek's orientation towards Hegel. I guess I sort of see you, like, as I would understand it, you're kind of very influenced by Pippin, um, but you see him as kind of too epistemological, and that there's a kind of more, it's more like full-fledged, full-throated German idealism that you're kind of like looking to develop, but in the context of the kind of like radical Marxism in the like academic leftist sense of the term that someone like Daniel Tutt or Zizek would be interested in. Would you say that's kind of right?
Yeah, yeah, I'd say so. Yeah,
Um, so question one is sort of philosophy on Twitter. Question two, we'll talk a little bit about what I know of your work. I think I only know parts of it. Three, the psychoanalytic interpretation of Hegel and your critique of it. I think I might have some disagreement of you with you, but I'm more on your side, I think. Uh, and then Hegel and Christianity.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, I guess to start, like, but I do kind of like, okay, so this guy, can we talk about John the Hegelian a little bit?
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely,
so
definitely.
like like I first encountered him, he was like kind of reply guying me with stuff that I think that I was saying about either Hegel or about Orthodox Christianity, because he converted to Orthodoxy sort of in the time since we began talking a bit. And for people who don't know, I practice Orthodox Christianity, and I kind of see it as part of my practice, like that my actual life as a Christian is part of my work in music and in philosophy or whatever.
Right.
Um, and so that was kind of, like, what is, and so he kind of, his take on Hegel is very, it's very much like almost like McTaggart level, like it's like British idealism, like it's really like uh
Yeah.
uh genuinely theistic, but then he takes it in this direction where he kind of tries to turn it into this reactionary thing, and somehow kind of manipulate it into, you know, uh like overturning any kind of humanism basically or something. So like I kind of thought he was cool
Yeah.
for a while, and then I saw how much we disagreed, and so now I started yelling at him and stuff, and like I think, well, we're not really talking anymore. But
Right.
you and he were debating, and it was kind of cool because you're a real like you're an academic. Like I think you're at Harvard, right? Like
Yeah.
you're like an Ivy League academic, and he's just kind of this guy online who's quite smart. But like what? So how? I guess what are your thoughts about just generally Twitter as a medium for philosophy, as someone who is like in the truly in the ivory tower?
Right. It's a bit of a mixed bag in the sense that it's very imperfect for actually doing philosophical work. Obviously, there are medium constraints to make it really hard, and there's all sorts of room for distortion. And to some degree, the engagement is always going to be, uh, you know, superficial at a certain level, just because of the amount that you can do. Um, but what I think has been really interesting for me is that, uh, you know, I mean, most of my most serious philosophical interlocutors these days are people that I met on Twitter within like the last 2 or 3 years. And like people that I have like relationships with offline and spend a lot of time with and spend a lot of time conversing with. And so that was sort of a meeting ground. And it later turned into something really serious. But I also think that, yeah, I mean, the way that it sort of works is it allows one to make very provocative statements in a kind of shorthand form. And that can be useful for starting conversations, but it can also lead to stuff where, like, I don't know, I mean, I say provocative stuff all the time on there just as a way of starting conversations. And people can get really mad and, be like, well, why aren't you like providing arguments or whatever? And it's like, well, I'm
Right.
happy to do that if you want to have a conversation, but that's just sort of the nature of the medium. This is like, we're working within 140 characters or whatever. And that's one of the cool things about it, I think, but it's also one of the potential pitfalls. Um, Now, the guy that you're talking about, and just so I'm sure we're talking about the same person, this is the guy whose handle or whatever was right Hegelian for a while, right? This
Yeah.
guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what's interesting about him is that he is clearly very smart and actually knows Hegel rather well. And, I think I've looked at his blog several times and, yeah, I mean, he definitely knows his way around the texts. Um, but two things there sort of seemed sort of off to me. And one was that, um, as you sort of pointed out, he has this older, very hardcore kind of like metaphysical, theological reading of Hegel. And, which in itself, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that there's someone who would want to defend that these days. I mean, there aren't a ton of people who maybe
Right.
want to go that
Right.
route.
Yeah. It's refreshing in that way, actually.
Exactly, exactly. And I
And
don't have a problem.
it's in a
Yeah,
lot of ways the most obvious way to read Hegel too. If you just
yeah,
sit down and look at Hegel, like it's kind of Hegel's reading of Hegel in a way, or at least superficially it seems like
yeah,
it would be.
yeah, 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 definitely, definitely. But it also became apparent, like talking to him, that there there were certain consequences of that way of reading, which I think were inevitable. Like if you're going to take up that path, there are certain claims that you're going to end up committed to just necessarily, which at the same time, he sort of realized that maybe those were not claims that he wanted to be committed to and would back away from them. So there were these tensions. Like, I mean, we had this back and forth. The most serious back and forth I ever had with him was about uh, this famous footnote in the philosophy of nature where Hegel talks about Hegel had been criticized for trying to deduce everything from pure thinking or something, like trying to deduce Krug's pen is the idea that you could
Right.
use
Like
the pen that you're writing with.
like this, like Hegel
Exactly.
deduced this, yeah.
Exactly. And if you adopt a really strong metaphysical reading in which you think that you know there is sort of no difference between um, the kind of being that we're talking about in the logic, like a category, and the kind of empirical being out there in the world, like the everyday objects that we're encountering. If you think that there's no conceptualization between those two things, you're going to end up committing something like the view that you can use Krug's pen from, just by thinking. And we sort of went around and around about this, and he, I think, didn't really want to end up saying that, but the reading was sort of forcing him to go in that direction, in my view. So that was one side of it that, I found interesting, and a tension that I saw in the reading. And then there was another sort of political side to that. And I don't know if you want to go into that or not. We can, but it's up to you.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I mean, I think the way that I was first exposed to him, I guess, was one of my mutuals on there had been tweeting about the Frankfurt School or something, and I think that right Hegelian um, responded, and I don't remember what the context was, but he just said that, like, oh, well, the problem with X, or the problem with the Frankfurt School or whatever, is that they're Jewish. And so there was this, which, and to be fair, one has to kind of understand this kind of claim within the context of these Hegelian texts that he's drawing on, not to excuse it at all. But I think that so in these earlier Hegel texts, like The Spirit of Christianity, Hegel developed this critique of Judaism, and he famously sort of even criticizes Kant for being a Jew in this text. So he has a very specific meaning of this idea, which it's not a sort of ethnographic category for him, but it's a doctrinal category for him, which is how Hegel's using it.
Right.
But the way that
Conceptually Jewish or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Uh,
that's right Hegelian's defense of his use of that term. It's like, oh no, I mean it the way that I mean it as
yeah,
a form of thought, right?
yeah, exactly. But the problem with that is that um, uh, that very kind of mode of criticism, um, it's it's not just that it's now anachronistic, but it's also, I think, uh, yeah, I mean, you can't really abstract away from the history of the 20th century. And that sort of criticism now means something different than it could have ever meant for, Hegel. And I think if you're going to, and I guess the maybe one way to put the point is that, I mean, right Hegelian, as I understood it, he really wants to articulate a critique of modernity through the idea that modernity is too Jewish in this Hegelian sense. But given the history of the 20th century, given the sort of and this sort of critique, I mean, it has a history in Marxist thought too, but I think that there are severe limitations, to pursuing a critique of modernity in terms primarily of Judaism.
Severe limitations. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, yeah. And this is, I mean, that's like, that's a funny way of putting it. Like, yeah, I mean, so the thing about philosophy online, um, is that I like it. I do it. I mostly do, to the extent that I do philosophy. It's kind of through Substack and Twitter and like occasional journal articles and stuff. But like, um, uh, on the one hand, it's like the agora, like yeah, you want philosophy in the world, so it's great that it's on Twitter. Like people should be reading philosophy in the street and discussing it, and that's actually kind of that was always a hope of German idealism too, kind of, to have people doing philosophy more. uh the difficulty with it being mediated by algorithms is that uh, um, like something like Twitter is like an outrage machine. And so, yeah, like I don't think, I'm not as sensitive about identity politics as you are probably, but like John the Logician is, I think, being, um, choosing to be provocative. It's not like it was an accidental choice of like being insensitive. It's like because you get more engagement, the
Yeah.
more that you um, you know, challenge the Overton window, and
Right.
and 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 that and that's not bad in itself. I mean, I do think that, like, as someone who really likes materialist philosophy, say the philosophy of Deleuze and stuff like that, which I think right Hegelian doesn't know anything about even anyway, but like where like you want to be in principle, an original philosopher wants to be challenging common sense, and so
Yeah.
that like so there's a style of philosophizing that should uh should cause outrage, uh but
Yeah.
I don't know that Deleuze predicted the algorithm exactly, where like it's not quite the same as like the sort of, I don't know, like avant-garde flaneur or something like that, who's like a free thinker in the same way. Like we can't be free thinkers as much, because everything is so mediated by profit.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Um,
Yeah,
and
that's a very interesting point. Yeah, that seems right to me. Right.
and so yeah, maybe. Well, do you want to say anything else on that? I mean, that's kind of a nice segue into the next topic. But do you want to,
Yeah, no, I mean that's yeah, we can move on.
like, so then, I guess, to start segueing towards the specifics of your ideas, there is this, um, I mean, before we even get to that exactly, there is this sociological fact or whatever, world historical fact that, um, well, maybe you would disagree with this, but that academia is in a weaker position than it once was, or something. I mean, I guess to say the least, right? And so like,
Oh
um,
yeah, it's definitely true.
and like, especially in the English speaking world, of academia, um, the interpretations of people like Hegel are pretty, flat and plain, and so like, I first encountered the world of thinkers like Pippin and people in the Pittsburgh school, through, like, I was into kind of, Zizek's Hegel, and then getting into accelerationism, and then left accelerationism, and then this kind of,
Yeah.
um, as a world, people like Brassier being like, we want to be really, really, really radical Marxists, but the kind of Hegel, that, we need to look to Brandom and talk about norms and this kind of thing. And but I actually studied Hegel in college too, and and people like Pippin, uh uh well, okay. So you, like, what I wrote down is you talk about the logic. Okay, I mean, basically you're pushing back against that a little bit. Like it seems like your reading of Hegel is more ambitious than someone like Pippin's, in that those especially in anglophone world, everything is very, very safe. And like everything has kind of scare quotes on it. And so you
That's right.
are
Yeah. Yeah.
and so you talk about a the logic as a metaphysical deduction of rational life. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. I mean, I
Okay.
can sort of lay out the terrain a little bit, and uh, yeah. So I think that within the sort of ongoing analytic Anglo-American, whatever one wants to call it, reception of Hegel, there is this tendency to translate Hegel back into a familiar set of terms that were dominant throughout the second half of the 20th century. And in a lot of ways, I think that that's been incredibly productive and has made certain things in Hegel more intelligible. Um, like I think someone like Brandom, um, Brandam's notion of like an inferential semantics, trying to understand Hegel in terms of like a theory of conceptual content, I think is really powerful. Um, I think Pippin develops a very sophisticated understanding of Hegel's sort of account of institutions. Um, but holding all of that to one side, what specifically I'm interested in is, well, maybe one way to put it is like, so for a long time, there was this idea that Hegel, I mean, the sort of criticism that one often uses that Pippin's Hegel is a Kantianized Hegel or an epistemological Hegel. And it's not that this is completely false. In his sort of most important work, his 1989 work, there are some notorious lines where Pippin says things like, well, once we've gone through something like the logic and we've developed all of these categories, this question remains like, well, how do we get back to like the world? How do we get back to empirical reality? And the thought is that like, oh, we're still trapped in this basically behind this set of epistemic constraints, and we have no contact with like the thing itself, the actual world. And so the claim for a long time was that well, okay, Pippin has basically just taken the logic and transformed it into a category theory a la Kant. And this is just, what's impressive or what's interesting or what's new about this. But then a few years ago, when I first got into Pippin, it was back in 2012, and I was living in Germany at the time, and he came, and I saw him give a paper called it was called something like Hegel's Logic as Metaphysics, Hegel's Realm of Shadows, which later became the title of his most recent Hegel book. And basically, what he was trying to do in this paper, and what he's trying to do in the book, is to shut down this idea that he sort of Kantianized Hegel. And one way, I guess, of putting like the sort of image rehabilitation work that he's trying to do, he's trying to show that basically this account of thinking and the logic, this account of categories in the logic, these are not just forms of thought. They truly are forms of being. Like what Hegel is giving us is he's giving us an account of how things themselves must actually be. So it's not the case that Hegel's just doing this sort of epistemic work. He's also trying to, he's trying to show that logic, how we have to think about the world, and metaphysics, how things must be, that these two things coincide. So I think that I think that this is like the right way to understand Pippin's project. I think it's the way that he understands it. But even given that more generous interpretation of what he's doing, I still think that there are, um, some major limits. And one of them, uh, I think one of the bigger ones has to do with how Hegel thinks about the category of life. So in like the last 5 years, 10 years or so, there's been like an explosion of interest in the Hegel world and Hegel's understanding of biological categories and specifically his understanding of uh, what an organism is. This is an important topic um, in Kant's Third Critique, in Aristotle, and it's also really important for Hegel. And basically, what I've tried to show in some of my recent work is that I think that while Pippin is trying to give us something like an account of um, uh, how we have to think about being, how we have to think about the world, uh, and not just in an epistemic sense, but Pippin wants to say that how we have to think about the world tells us something about how the world actually is. But I think that there's an inverse question which he never really asks, and it's not just the question of, sort of the thought of being, but the question of the being of thought. Like, what must it mean to be a thinker?
Mm.
And for me, the way into this question is this category that Hegel develops of rational life. So one of the things that Hegel is trying to do at the end of the logic is to show, um, what must be true of any kind of rational being, of any kind of agent, any kind of thinker. And one of the most fundamental constraints, according to the account that he provides, is that you have to be alive, you have to be living, you have to be a material, embodied being susceptible to death and decay. And part of what is so intriguing about this thought is, we're used to getting an account of the end of the logic as sort of an ascent to the heights of immortality or whatever. And that's not exactly false, but part of what Hegel is trying to show is that it is just eternally true that to be a rational being is to be subject to the possibility of withering and death. So this is one of the core thoughts that I'm interested in, is this attempt to give a kind of logical account of what it means to be an embodied material agent. And this is a metaphysical point. This is not just an epistemological account about how we have to understand ourselves. It's an account of how we have to be reasoners at all. So that's a lot, but that's
Yeah,
roughly
yeah.
the
And so it's not human centric because it's basically the structure of pure thought.
exactly.
Uh, and so being something that will die is part of it. I guess, like, I mean, having a sense of the good is a part of it, right? Like that sort of like striving to improve somehow, and having that involve
Yeah,
renegotiating your sense of what you are as well, right?
exactly, exactly, exactly. Yeah, those are all. So it's crucial for the picture that um, I mean, partly what Hegel wants to show is that already in like non-rational organisms, there's already a sense of, all animal life, they're trying to keep themselves going and they make distinctions between what's good for them and what's bad for them. And in our case, we're making these same sorts of discriminations, but it's always possible for us to call those discriminations into question. We're not just committed to a certain notion of the good. We're always having to sort of re-adjudicate the question of what is the good. This is not just given in our case. And that's what sort of creates a historical dynamic, because then there's some form of historical narrative about the divergent conceptions of the good that we've had over time. Um, so that's sort of yeah, I think the heart of
And
the thought.
and would you say that like how does, so you as a you would describe yourself as a leftist, right? Sort of a Marxist leftist. Like, would that mean that is that um that adjudication and so forth, um let's see, it's kind of a hand-fisted way of putting it, but like, do you feel like that is intrinsically leftist? You know, like does that mean that that kind of um, grounds in emancipatory politics in the nature of
That's right.
the nature of thought? Because I think that's the kind of thing that like a lot of academics will, like, they won't even consider, you know, that say something like right Hegelian would be like, oh yeah, like, actually the metaphysics is right wing, actually metaphysics is fascist or something. Like what? So what are your thoughts on that? And because I think the answer
Great question.
could be yes, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a great question. Yeah, so one of the really interesting things I think about Hegel's system as a whole is Hegel wants to say that, like, okay, if we take this idea at the end of the logic of rational life, and we know that this has a certain structure, and if we really think about what it would mean to realize that structure, uh, we would basically have to be committed to, something like an account of, um, freedom. I mean, that's ultimately where Hegel wants to go, is to say that we need some account of, and ultimately he wants to say modern freedom. Uh, and to the extent that that's true, I think that yes, even the logical account, um, there is a certain sense in which it's yeah, that it's even innately leftist, to the extent that, like, um, you can't you can't actually be a rational being on the Hegelian account unless uh, you are um, sort of participating in um, institutions premised on some form of mutual recognition. And that means that for, I mean, and Hegel has, like, if one reads the philosophy of right, I mean, Hegel has all sorts of things to say that, that we would not regard as necessarily progressive at all. But if one thinks through the thought, I mean, Hegel doesn't have to get his own ideas right. I mean, he can be wrong, certainly, about, the implications of his own ideas.
Yeah.
One really thinks through his conception of rationality, then yeah, I mean, I think that where we ultimately end up is with communism. I mean, I think that that's what it means to be a rational agent. Those are the conditions that would have to be in place. I mean, that's a big claim, and one would have to show it, but yeah.
What do you mean by communism there?
Um, so I guess, I mean, one could be pat about it and just say, uh, from each according to its ability, to each according to its need. But to put a little bit more flesh on those bones, yeah, I mean, a form of society in which how and what we produce is, democratically determined by us collectively. A form of life in which, you know, no one has to work to survive individually, and in which the work that, people would do would be work that they would identify with, wouldn't feel alienated from. Um, and I think that those are sort of crucial pillars of a possible emancipated form of life,
Hmm.
in which, I mean, if the classic sort of Hegelian slogan is "no one can be free unless all are," there are certain material conditions that must be in place for that to be true. And I think that the baseline for that is overcoming something like wage labor, like the kind of
Hmm.
labor that we have to perform in our, current
Um,
capitalist society.
yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, I feel like communism would also have to include uh uh self-realization in like, well, okay, put it this, okay, actually, this is a great um segue into maybe the next topic I wanted to get to, kind of, which is the psychoanalysis side of things, right? So we have kind of the, random fascist who wants the Russian Empire to conquer the world or whatever on one side, and then we have say Klosowski. I don't know if you're very familiar with Klosowski. I've really enjoyed his book called Living Currency, that is a vision of a basically it's like a sadist version of communism. um but and so just generally speaking, just to step back from Klosowski specifically, uh in the sphere of you know um thinkers like, let's say Deleuze and Guattari are really the major ones, also Badiou, uh Zizek. There is this idea of an ontology that is essentially kind of takes the shape of the subject of psychoanalysis, right? That the unconscious, things like the phallus and castration and so forth, are kind of written into the heart of being. And Hegel is actually sort of interpreted as saying that, like they read Hegel through this Lacanian lens.
Right.
um and I mean, you made a really cool point in the conversation with Daniel Tutt that I just looked at last night, that like you could say that all of that is kind of unhappy consciousness, basically. That like, if you're going to uh you know conceive of yourself as kind of subjected to this structure, that's actually
Yeah.
fairly like non-galaxy brained as a Hegelian. Like, you can really level
Yeah.
up and be like, actually, we can construct whatever we want. Like in intersubjectivity, I mean, that's maybe a facile way of putting it, but that intersubjectivity uh, doesn't have a structure like that. That we'll find out what intersubjectivity is later or something. Where that can be renegotiated. The thing, it seems like the limitation of that view would be something like that. um like, thinking about how they came to that in the first place with say Deleuze, where, like, prior to, like, if Deleuze is sort of an intervention of Freud and Marx, like, Deleuze is kind of like Hegel's world spirit, but instead of starting with Kantian apperception, or starting with Kantian apperception, but then kind of adding in, like, giving it an unconscious almost, right?
Yeah.
And so, uh, one could accuse you of basically just going in and taking the unconscious out of the world spirit, and just kind of undoing the psychoanalytic reading of Hegel. So, like, how would you respond to that? Like, do you feel like you have a kind of have you sublated the psychoanalytic reading, or are you just rejecting it?
Yeah. Great question. I think that there are several different layers to this problem because so on the first level, uh, you know, it's just clearly the case that in Hegel's sort of philosophy of history and the developmental narrative that he wants to give, um, how we got to be where we are, um, he does want to absolutely say that that process is, he calls it the cunning of reason, but, we could also use some notion of the unconscious to talk about this, where, you know, uh, in his terms, social actors are realizing sort of rational goals that they themselves are not conscious of. Um, and that necessarily presupposes some notion of an unconscious. But on this sort of historical view, Hegel does want to say eventually that, like, the cunning of reason is not the structure of rational life as such. It's the structure of rational life up until the point when, we actually own up to, um, you know, our responsibility for determining our institutions and form of life, et cetera, et cetera. It's, nothing beyond us. It ultimately is us, et cetera. So that's one side of it. But I take it that the question that you're asking is a slightly deeper one, which is, okay, even if there can be this kind of like historical form of self-deception and historical form of, uh, unconsciousness, this tradition wants to say that unconsciousness is, or the unconscious is, it's just constitutive of what it is to be us. There is no sort of extirpating this notion of the unconscious, and it can seem a little bit like this is an aspect of human life, or rational life, that I'm just eliminating. I think it's uh, I guess there's a couple of different things I'd want to say about it. One would be that uh, I think we always need the possibility of making the distinction between um, conscious and unconscious commitments, and that this must always be true of any form of human life, that no matter how rational or emancipated a society is, there's always a possibility for this sort of disjunction between what I'm doing, or what I take myself to be doing, and what I'm actually doing. And for there to be that kind of distinction, we have to have some, it just analytically, it requires some possibility of the unconscious. So
Like,
I think that that's
can I pause for 1 second? Also, like, but also not just unconscious, but also say a thirst for transgression and destruction. Like, that's so, like the painful insight of Freud or something, is that there is perhaps underlying the social bond. There's this death wish, basically.
okay.
Um,
All
and
right.
so, yeah.
Right. Okay. So on that side of it, on the drive issue, there I'm much less willing to make concessions, I think.
Right.
Um, and that's because I think that the picture that Hegel gives us, Hegel wants to say that there is a conatus of reason, that there's a fundamental drive not to death, but um, to rational self-realization. And this can become perverted in all sorts of ways, and it can lead to all sorts of, social deformations, etc. But the fundamental drive itself, on his account, is always a drive towards rational self-realization, such that, even when, I don't know, um, uh, and this can generate all sorts of compulsions and desires that are incredibly self-destructive. But Hegel still wants to say that there is a kind of rational kernel to even these self-destructive desires and drives, which can ultimately be cashed out in terms of um, this desire for rational self-realization or flourishing. And I think that I find that picture more compelling for a number of reasons, but I can pause there if you want to jump in.
Sure. Well, I mean, yeah, I could imagine. I also didn't want to interrupt the train you were on about just unconsciousness as such, but um one can imagine uh uh like I could maybe still man the argument that even if there is a kind of cosmic death drive, that that's actually a contingency that the world spirit could outgrow or something like that, you know,
Yeah.
essentially. Um, but then there is, and maybe this will start nudging us towards the Christianity concept, that there does then seem to be something pretty theological uh, in that reading of Hegel. So, maybe um, because if at the heart of being there is this kind of um, fundamental good of some kind that
Yeah.
that has no, maybe has no need of evil. I mean, well, this is another whole topic, as we can get into kind of Hegel as a Neoplatonic versus Hegel as a Christian and that kind of thing. But like, um, what, yeah, do you want to keep talking about the unconsciousness thing, and also with an eye towards the eye towards whether you see Hegel as doing theology of a kind, or seeing yourself as making
Yeah.
theological claims at all in your reading of Hegel? Because like, I mean, that's also, I think, part of the motive in Anglophone scholars in kind of cutting off the side of the being of thought is that uh is that sort of inherently gets into kind of theological territory. And the uh um that if it was fairly obvious to most German idealists that the absolute spirit precisely was this kind of nexus between the epistemological and the metaphysical, that's something that secular scholars have tended to get away from, that metaphysical side, because it's inherently theistic potentially, which they wouldn't want.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I do think that Hegel is a theological thinker, the theological with an asterisk next to it. But the just to say, I guess, one more thing about the drive point by way of a transition to the theology sort of Christianity point. Um, I think that there's a tendency to think. I mean, this is certainly how like someone like Zizek theorizes or talks, that we need this notion of drive, in part to uh, just account for the very possibility of action and striving, because if the way that, like, at least on the Zizekian and maybe the Lacanian version, if one thinks that Zizek is faithful to Lacan, if the thought is something like, well, there's always a sort of drive to reproduce um, our own condition of lack, such that basically there's an impetus to, because without that, if you're not reproducing the lack, then there's nothing. I mean, then it's just non-being. There's nothing left to do or to be at all. And so they think that in order to account for the possibility of being, you have to have that basically you can never get what you want, because if you were to get what you would want, then you don't have anything. You're dead on that sort of view. And I think that the Hegelian logic is very, very different, and the way that the sort of answer that Hegel provides to this question, it's 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 relying on a much older Aristotelian logic, which has to do with this idea that um, you know, in order to be striving to fulfill a purpose, you don't have to be characterized by lack. It doesn't have to be a lack that's driving that. And I mean, like in the examples that Aristotle gives of energeia, this category of actuality, like the whole idea is that, you know, the activity, whatever the activity is, it could be being healthy, it could be, I don't know, being a parent, whatever. If the activity is an end in itself, then at every moment that you're sustaining the activity, you're already complete and realized. But the activity itself just is the ongoing attempt, you know, to sustain that realization. So you don't actually have to be motivated by a form of lack, in the sense that um, you can never be who you're purporting to be, or you can never be who you're trying to be. Uh, the notion of completion or realization is built into the sense of activity itself, and I think that that logic is the one that Hegel is really committed to, and it's very different from the kind of lack logic that that one gets on the Lacanian picture.
That makes sense.
And yeah, and I think maybe that brings us to the theological issue too.
Yeah, I mean, you can get, well, yeah. So yeah, it's like that there's a sheer enjoyment in like playing the guitar or something, or like, getting better at something, that there's this, that it doesn't have to start with um it doesn't have to start with a, uh and I mean, Lacan himself kind of has this too, like, because yeah, Zizek does really distort Lacan, that like there's this idea, like there's a lack, which is, um uh a sense of something missing, and that that is kind of like this more low level thing, and then there's like a void at a higher level, and like the cure is in a way passing from the lack to the void, and the void is like in topological space, where it's just kind of like, something to circulate around, but it's not something missing, and that's like the kind of, um you know there's like Aristotelian flourishing is kind of circulating around some kind of, infinite point like that, or an asymptote of some kind, maybe. Um,
That's right. Yeah, yeah,
so I would say that, that, um, I mean, the way I kind of schematize the world, right, as someone, as like a committed Christian, right, that there's kind of like, there's your pagans, and those are the Aristotelianism, as you described it, kind of like this, um, that derives, I guess, derives ethics from a kind of nature somehow, a kind of like primordial
yeah.
affirmation, and then you have your Gnostics, who have this kind of, they derive, um, they view the world as fundamentally fallen, basically, and that they, something has to be wrong, the it's, you need to either accept that, or escape, or maybe destroy everything, um and but then there is what I would call a Christian conception, which is that the world, really is fallen. There really was a fall, but that it can be redeemed also. So, and that's a pretty Marxist conception too. So, kind of Christian Marxism. Um, but if Hegel, well, I mean, I wanted to ask you about Hegel's, um, what Hegel says about Christianity. And it's not something that I've looked closely at recently, but like, I remember at a time reading, I kind of have the lore in my mind that his basic idea is that, his great contribution to world history is to, uh, subjugate the truth of Christianity to the concept, essentially. So that like Christianity is the highest religion, and but it sort of presented its truths as mysteries and images and so forth, and that, Hegel's intervention into history is, preserving those truths, but kind of transcending and including them by making them, uh,
Yeah.
conceptual, and so it's like philosophy sort of subjugates religion, which is something that I think there are shortcomings, in that view, at least to a degree. So, and I, in my kind of conception of world history, conceiving of it sort of from the standpoint of Christianity, I like to contextualize Hegel as, uh, living in a moment of history, right, where he's a Lutheran, uh, and that there are, there are kind of limitations, that there's an all too human aspect, I guess, of his work, that there are limitations to what he was able to think, and assumptions he was making by virtue of kind of, um, living in the same culture, from which like, uh, you know, like from which Bach had emerged, a century or two earlier or whatever. And, so, I didn't really let you finish talking about Hegel as a theologian, but, um, yeah, maybe, also specifically in his relationship to Christianity. Like I guess I see him, like it's not that crazy to say Hegel is theological. You know, it's kind of in certain circles that sounds crazy or something, but like he just, you know, is theological. But that it would still, um I think of him as being on the, in a way, I guess I would categorize him as on the Gnostic side of things, even though you're putting him on the Aristotelian side, which I would call pagan, but that like that he thinks that God needed to create the world, that he sort of had no choice or something like that, in the sense that, um, you know, something like that in the overall image of his thought is that there's this kind of sentence, uh, and there's like a subject and a predicate, and like the word sort of has to be said or something. Um, and so anyway, I'm kind of darting around a little bit, but it's all kind of
Yeah,
in the same
yeah.
area.
Yeah, I mean, that last bit reminded me. I mean, one of the famous lines from the Logic is when Hegel says that you know, the logic itself, uh, uh, the point of the logic is to articulate, you know, the mind of God, you know, before the creation. And I think that and Hegel has other stuff too, like in the philosophy of nature, where, you know, this he points to the question of like, well, you know, one of the traditional philosophical metaphysical questions is, you know, whether or not the world or the universe has a beginning in time. And Hegel's point is that these are all just sort of category mistakes because, you know, the idea of nature itself just is eternal. And the idea of, you know, the being and the logic, it just is eternal. There is, in a way, like the very notion of creation, you know, presupposes that there was some act or some moment prior to, but for Hegel, that's just going to be unintelligible. It just it always is, always will be, um, you know, and that just sort of is. But anyway, on the theological point, I think that yeah, Hegel's a theological thinker in the sense that, I mean, you nicely reconstructed the basic position, and that he thinks that, yeah, he thinks that Christianity is true. And he thinks that Christianity is true for a number of reasons, but one of the most important is, I mean, Hegel says that, you know, it's with Christianity that, you know, the thought of freedom first really arises in the world. Uh, Precisely because one's relationship between oneself and God, it becomes a question of, I mean, again, this reflects a certain Lutheran prejudice, but it's your relationship with God, and it's a question of your faith, your individual faith, and you know, it's not just your um, uh, it's not a law that can be given to you from without. It's not something that you can just be forced into. Ultimately, you can only give yourself that relationship with God or not. And that's what was so important to him on the one side about the development of Christianity. And then on the other side, there's a crucial metaphysical point, which is that he thinks that um, that the Trinity and the resurrection, that these are both extremely significant pictorial sort of representations of speculative forms. So in the one case, the Trinity represents the form of the concept, which he's going to, in the logic, he's going to grasp that in terms of the structure of the syllogism. And then in the case of the resurrection, he also thinks that that's like basically a model for what he calls determinate negation. And so he thinks that these are truths that are already contained in Christianity, but they're not yet conceptually or rationally comprehended. Uh, so in that sense, I think that that
Wait. The resurrection he identifies with determinate negation or crucifixion.
well, I guess it would be I
Or
guess they both since the uh, yeah, because he talks about sort of both in terms of determinate negation in the phenomenology. Um,
Yeah, no, I'm clouding on the details of it. I'm not like correcting you or something, but
yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I just I rethink thinking about it myself again too.
yeah,
Yeah,
that somehow like the crucible of Christ is the dialectic itself, basically.
yeah, and that Christ basically had to die so that he could be resurrected in the form of community of believers, and that crucifixion and resurrection story for Hegel uh, is essentially like the very for the idea of civilization itself.
And and
So
and then do you see, because and then Zizek is always excited to emphasize that once the community of believers is born, and I'm not sure exactly where Zizek locates this in history, whether it's really Pentecost or whether it's psychoanalysis or something, but that then God is dead after that. So that there's no more, uh, that, for Christians, the Holy Spirit comes down to earth, to sort of help us, keep develop the church until heaven. But God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit are still also there in heaven. Uh, Whereas, by Zizek's reading of Hegel, that's it's this kind of atheism, and it's I think it's always a little bit slippery of like what is really meant. Like I think he describes it meaning that God dies, right? That basically that the death of God really is that the crucifixion itself is the death of God, and God died. Maybe he was alive before, but then now he's dead, or that something like from the attitude of immanence in doing philosophy, that you see now that there never was a God, or something like that is probably more like what he means. But so like how do you see Hegel? Do you feel like Hegel, I mean, because Hegel clearly does, the Trinity for him is eternal. um
yeah,
so yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think it's more like a sublation of God in the sense that the death of God is you know uh, it's the birth of the community of believers, but it's also um, I mean, he sort of characterizes this as like the speculative Good Friday at the end of faith and knowledge, where I take it that the idea eventually is going to be also that like it's not that we simply get rid of God. That would be an abstract negation to just cancel out the idea of God, but that God becomes identified with the structure of rationality itself. And if we rationally comprehend the idea of God, then what we're, actually comprehending is, um, the eternal structure of reason per se, or something like that. And for Hegel, that is a theological thought, but uh, in a rationalist sense, because he thinks it's conceptually comprehensible. We can give an account of that as bearing, again, a certain syllogistic structure, and it's also having a kind of, uh, I mean, maybe the way to put the point is like this: that what Hegel wants to get away from is the idea of divinity as something that stands outside of or beyond us. He thinks that that's precisely the logic that gives rise to something like the unhappy consciousness. And he wants to show instead that the only way to consistently think the idea of divinity is as something like the rational structure of, Geist, or human existence, or rational life itself, or something like that. And so it's theological in the sense that it is an eternal thought. It's the thought that is never not true, and in that sense, it's in a certain way it's immortal. But it's not a theological thought in a traditional sense that we really are talking about a something like a divine creator. I mean, Heidegger makes this distinction, which I'll exploit to make this Hegelian point, where Heidegger distinguishes between ontic creation and ontological creation, where he identifies ontic creation with the traditional narrative, where the world is understood as an object that has an artificer, a maker, versus ontological creation, where the world is understood as something that's disclosed in its being or constituted in its being by forms of thought or forms of reason. And I take it that that latter notion of ontological creation is the one that Hegel wants to endorse.
Um, yeah. But okay. So let me debate you from a couple of angles at the same time, and we'll see what sticks. We'll see what you want to disagree with. Like, so first of all, um, part of what is of interest to me about the Orthodox tradition of Christianity, as opposed to the Western Catholic and Protestant tradition, is that for theologians in this realm, um, philosophy itself, philosophy as such, uh, can't effectively provide truth without being combined with liturgical practice in some way. And that's something that Western thinkers like Aquinas, for example, like right, they the scholastics, they have this kind of hyper rationalist form of theology that that gave birth to the scientific revolution, and it gave birth to the modern West, basically, and that in the East, it's not that the theologians were any less rigorous, but that they just had. I mean, I guess I'm not sure that I'm qualified to make that claim for sure, but like that that they had very complex and consistent systems of thought, like Maximus the Confessor and Palamas and people like this, but they believed that um, that truth requires like affect. It requires like physical practice of some kind, right? That it has to be kinetic, uh, and that even I think that it needs to be connected, like very specifically to the singular truth of Jesus's resurrection, right? That they like take seriously that there was this man, a human being that was God and came to Earth, and that they're dogmatic about that, and like that 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 there are perspectives from which a fully Swedenborgian account of the heavens, that has like God in it with that's a person that like it's not, it's as far from Heideggerian as possible, that um that maybe it's a bit of a mystification that you can apply Occam's razor to the heavens in the way um that Kant or Heidegger would want you to have. They're like that what Kant was doing in his antinomies about the divine, uh, was he was just limiting, he was putting blinders on philosophy, rather than making a positive claim about what the real logic of becoming is, and that there was this like uh, kind of sneaky thing that happened where then like uh, later German idealists and then French materialists turned the logic of uh, whatever kind of took material from Kant with apperception and judgment and all this sort of stuff, and kind of turned it into um, a logic of becoming that is metaphysical essentially. So I could say, um, one could criticize, one could suggest that you know maybe truth requires liturgical practice of some kind to really have it be awakened, and that Hegel was overly greedy somehow, and then I think it's a more common critique from the perspective of art, like it's very, people write books about this all the time. Hegel, when he says like the thought of God is the thought of God, or the thought of the absolute is, that he's not giving enough to materiality or to affect. And
Yeah.
and as someone who, plays music, like I kind of feel that in a way, that like there's a truth that comes from, say, an ecstatic musical experience that thought alone would not be able to provide. And then you could get into the psychoanalysis thing there too, again, that it feels like there's something perhaps in transgression or even in evil in a way, that um that has a role to play that you can't find in Hegel or something. I don't know. Those are some thoughts.
Great, great. Yeah, yeah, no, that's really excellent. I mean, the aesthetic question, I didn't say this earlier, but the aesthetic question has been another thing at sort of uh, the front of my mind, and it's one of the things that I work on is really the connection between this idea of life and Hegel's philosophy of art. Um, but on the liturgical practice thing and on the aesthetic thing, so one initial thought is that this point that you made, which if I understand it, I mean, I think I completely agree, which is that like you basically can't just have something like you can't have like reason entirely devoid of um, material embodied practice, affect, uh, you know, um, and similarly, like with philosophical truth, philosophical truth, it has to be embodied in some way. And even in like the early Hegel, like in Faith and Knowledge, I mean, one of his points there is that another very important thing about religious community is that um, it actually manifests the fact that our truths and our norms are dependent on the practical activities of the one subject to them or sustaining them. And what he means by that is that, like, I mean, there are these passages in Faith and Knowledge which, are about like the actual practices of believers. I think what you're calling liturgical practices, in which he wants to say that, like, you can't sort of have the normative statuses or the beliefs, the doctrinal beliefs that they take themselves to have without engaging in some way in worship, in song, in prayer, etc. Like that's constitutive of having those beliefs. You can't have them separate from those practical dimensions. So I think that he's on board with that, but the claim that's being made at like the logical level and something like the logic is Hegel's saying that like that point, namely the point that there is that inseparability between like reason and practice or truth and practice or belief and practice, that point is a logical point that has to be made purely. And that's a point that he wants to make at the sort of highest logical level, to say that like, well, you can't even actually make sense of the very notion of what a truth is or what a practice is without grasping their reciprocal dependence. So that's one side of it. And then I guess on the other side, um, I guess there's a few different ways that one could go, but I think that in Hegel's account of art, um, like in the lectures on aesthetics, he so just to recap this basic movement or argument in Hegel, which is very well known. But if his thought is something like, that there are three forms of absolute spirit, art, religion, philosophy, and absolute spirit. What that means, these are the forms through which, spirit is comprehending itself, or through which we're giving an account of ourselves as spiritual beings. Like these are the forms through which we're grasping ourselves as spiritual beings, art, religion, philosophy. And this is a hierarchical order in Hegel's account, where he wants to say that, it's a hierarchical and a historical order in a way, where he wants to say that yes, like art dominates in something like the ancient form of life and the Greek form of life. It's an aesthetic way of life. And then in modernity, we finally reach philosophical maturity where we can, overcome our sort of religious and aesthetic. I mean, as Hegel famously says, art is now a thing of the past. It's an end of art thesis. But I think that the if one actually sort of reads what he has to say about like the logical structure of art, Hegel's very clear that what he calls sort of the concept or rationality, that it always has to have this affective dimension, that it always has to have, as he says, there's always going to be a non-conceptual form of the conceptual. And what he means by that is that, there always has to be these uh, uh, non-philosophical expressions or manifestations of speculative thought. And the places where these things can happen, they can be in art, they can be in religion. And I actually think that like Hegel is, in a way, he's not being fully consistent with his own thinking uh, when he sort of frames absolute spirit as in terms of these mutually exclusive alternatives, rather than saying that that there is a real way in which art, religion, and philosophy remain mutually interdependent, and you can't really have one without having the other three. And when one reads the actual like aesthetic theory that he's providing, I think it attests to this idea that there are certain things that you can only get from works of art. There are certain things about, the shape of a form of life that can't just be grasped from a theoretical perspective. It also has to be given this affective dimension. The experience of what it is to be a member of that form of life, that affective component, it's something that can be known, but not in a directly discursive way. So that was a lot. I don't know if that gets at some of
Yeah.
the worries, but
Yeah. Well, I mean, like it still sounds that uh like it seems like there are a couple of ways of reading it, reading what you're saying of Hegel here, that probably what it sounds most like he's saying directly, right, is that it's only philosophy that really you know makes contact with some kind of new horizon for truth, and that then these new ideas can then kind of be translated into art, for the sheeple, basically, like for that there are elites who can kind of do the philosophy,
yeah,
and that then uh, maybe it's not exactly that it's just like dumbing it down through art, that there's something qualitatively different about an artistic expression of the thought, but that still at the end of the day, thought has this kind of privileged access to the absolute. I think probably there's other people who would read Hegel. You'd know, I'm sure you're much more familiar with general secondary literature than me, but that, there's something like that, maybe that, like, because one would like an artist, usually wants to arrogate to themselves the right to make contact with the absolute as well. And so then you say, well, that new uh innovations in art that kind of trigger paradigm shifts, that they're touching the absolute as well.
yeah,
And then it's like, okay, so what we mean is that art itself is a form of thought, and there's like that art is thought after all. um and 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 it's like, okay, well, that's the way to read it, I guess. Maybe even against the grain or something, but then it's kind of like, um what was originally being said in the first place then about about thought kind of um transcending the function of religion. um I mean, and just this is kind of a totally different point, but there is also, um like, say someone take someone like Hans Urs von Balthasar, who you probably haven't read a lot of his work or something, but like he is You probably know who he is, at least, right? He's the great Catholic theologian of the 20th century, and he is a true great mind of modern times, and uh, and somewhat like he would simply say, like, he would be way more. I use the word Swedenborgian to mean to mean just that, like, the reality of heaven, as the reality of the divine as presented by Christianity, is like in no way metaphorical or something, right? That like it's actually real. So that, like, Balthazar, who has read Hegel and and stuff, like, would uh he believes he can even prove that philosophy uh it is inherently limited in what it can say about the absolute. He tries to do that in his work, and that then God speaks through scripture to people or something. That, like, that the phenomenon of praying, reading the Bible, whatever it is, like, as a Christian, you can sort of get on, like, God's team, in this, like, war in heaven between God and Satan, and that's all. uh it's like that way of viewing the world is not acceptable to the kind, like, I guess, the most, like, the most refined echelon of the secular sphere or something like that. But, like, that for someone like Balthazar, who really is not in no way an ignorant person, that's something that he takes seriously. So what do you think about stuff like divine revelation? um Maybe that's a hard question to go to something so far away, but, like, and I'm also curious about your response to the thing about kind of the hierarchy, whether there's a hierarchy between philosophy and art and religion.
Yeah, great. I mean, yeah, on the revelation question, it's an interesting one. It's we haven't really touched on this, but there's a important precursor to Hegel's account here, and I mean, and that's the account that Kant wants to provide, and religion within the balance of mere reason, where it's a kind of similar procedure, but also different in important respects, where Kant basically wants to make this distinction between, like, the moral and sort of the historical content of religion, and say that, well, you know, we can basically, I mean, this is very crude. This text is more sophisticated than this, but that basically on the historical stuff, like miracles, like all that, like, we can basically just, like, sort of discard all of that, because there's no way of, you know, really knowing whether it's true, and it's not clear what lessons are to be learned from it. But we can take the sort of, if we look at, like, the heart of the doctrine, that's where we can derive this sort of, like, rational content. And specifically, he says, like, if we look at the life of Jesus, we can see that basically the point of the life of Jesus it's a paragon of, like, of morality, and that you get sort of an illustration of the moral law from examining the life of Jesus. And this is what, like, a truly rational form of religion would look like. And I think Kant even characterizes this as, like, the invisible church. So a church shorn of all actual sort of religious infrastructure, and it's just about your relationship to the moral law as exemplified in the religious figure of Christ, or something like that.
Religion within the limits of reason alone, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that I mean, and it can seem that that's exactly what Hegel is also sort of arguing, but I think that it is it's importantly distinct, because Hegel doesn't just want to say that religion is a kind of symbol. He does want to say that there is something to the actual content of what's there, that is itself worthy of affirmation. I mention this because I think the place where the sort of Hegelian account is going to have the most, um, where it's going to probably be the most critical, I would imagine, is with something like an idea of revelation. Because for Hegel, the idea of revelation is, it's in part, like, that seems to me to be the core of what Hegel would want to leave behind, in as much as ultimately we want to be able to establish and derive the truths of religion, through the self-examination of reason, whereas something like revelation, that presupposes that there's a certain contingency to what's being given to you or to the doctrine being given to you, that it's not something that, is it's not something that can be grounded, but it has, he would characterize it as like positive, where that basically just means that it's like something outside of us that we're not responsible for in any way. And I think that would be his, like, he would put the point like this, that to the extent that, revealed doctrine has authority, we've conferred that authority on it. And if we've conferred authority on it, then that means it's no longer revealed doctrine, that it's now, in a way, it's a product of ourselves. And so he would want to push back against the idea of revelation on those kinds of like rational lines. Um, yeah, and I'll pause there.
So that would mean that like there's been, it's kind of interesting. So that there's been some, that with modernity some kind of barrier has been crossed, and that God couldn't send down a new covenant with man any longer after the Enlightenment or something like that.
Yeah.
And that we can kind of see now that when they were experienced in that way, maybe before that, like event horizon, that made sense at the time, but that now we recognize them as um, a human construction in some way. Um,
Yeah, and that's the I mean, whether one wants to call it a dilemma or an achievement, for the Hegelian, it would be an achievement, but the recognition that, like, you know, there is nothing can have authority for us unless we give it that authority. And that sort of cuts against the whole notion of, revelation, because the point is that it's supposed to have authority in and of itself, independently of, um, anything that we could confer upon it. But once we recognize that the structure of belief is such that, you know, we always have to take ourselves to have reasons for believing what we do, and those reasons are in some way self-authorized, then any sort of revealed doctrine that we would believe, whatever authority that we take it to have, that's something that only we can give to it. And for him, that's again, for him it's an achievement, but for others that could look like a prison house of authority or something like that.
okay. Um, yeah, this brings me to two other topics. Um, and maybe we can start winding down. I don't know how much time you have, but
Yeah, sure.
yeah, we can, as we kind of close in towards the 2 hour mark or whatever. So one is, um, let's see. I'll just say what they both are. So one is, I guess, uh, maybe going back to Marxism, like a Hegelian Marxism that would somehow be truly radical in some kind of, you know, way that's like scary to the established order, versus a liberalism, right? Like that the it's easier to imagine Hegel's theology recommending a progressive politics, basically, right? That kind of things improve uh, within the bounds of a kind of negotiation or something like that. Um, and so I'll just bracket that there's question of it, like what, like, how radical uh, How radical can a Hegelian Marxist be? Then there's this other question. Uh, I guess around post-humanism, but also Kant. Something that I'm kind of unclear on. Um, in Hegel, like I think there might be just a right answer to this question, and I just don't know a certain area of his thought well enough. In terms of his relationship to Kant, um, uh, so for Kant, the transcendental subject and transcendental apperception and so forth uh,
Yeah.
is kind of partitioned into I guess you could say faculties, right? That there's sort of intuition of space and time, uh, imagination, sensibility, understanding, reason, and there's kind of this hierarchy, right? And then traditionally Hegel is said to like that he's not very interested in Kant's antinomies around the self and God and the world as permanent barriers, that he kind of turns them into productive antinomies. And uh and then some more radical Hegelians will want to also uh discard the Kant's faculties, basically, right? That sort of um as we grow an understanding of what we are, but basically like there's one view that like there are different amounts of the Kant that you keep or something, right? So they can be like, well, you know our increase in self-understanding, like there will always be a distinction between intuition of space of time and imagination and understanding, more or less, between like thought and imagination and intuition. uh
Yeah.
but then like someone like I read Gabriel Catren's book recently, and he really likes this. He doesn't even talk about Hegel. Like, a lot of people don't even talk about Hegel, but they're doing Hegel. Like he uses Kant, but suggests that like no, none of those faculties are um intrinsically part of uh, metaphysical reason. That you don't even need them for judgment, or you don't even need judgment. Maybe all you need is Kant third critique or something like that. Like what, so I know you're on the Kantian side of things. I've never really fully understood what exactly Hegel says about like I know that he reads understanding and reason kind of differently from Kant, but
Yeah.
in terms of like intuition and imagination, and I'm bring this question up, I guess, with uh, posthumanism in mind, right? That like if there's a um, if we're thinking about communism as kind of like the high tech version of communism, where like humanity is really transformed, like what do you think via Hegel is you know how radical can that transformation be? I guess I don't know, that I kind of darted around, but I think I kind of made my question.
Right. Okay. Good. Yeah. So let's do the faculty thing first. This is a complicated question. I think the initial point I think that has to be made is that so early on in like texts like Faith and Knowledge, uh, Hegel has an important and an influential account of which interestingly Heidegger later echoes in important ways without really acknowledging Hegel in the late 20s. But Hegel basically in this text he has a critique of Kant where he more or less says that you know, well, so in Kant, you really have this sort of difficulty where you have the distinction between concept and intuition, but at a certain point, uh, they're, uh, he wants to say that they're not really integrated enough because you still have an inaccessible thing in itself on the other side of intuition. And Hegel takes the key to resolving this to already be sort of within Kant himself uh, in the A deduction of the first critique, where Kant originally articulates his account of the transcendental imagination, which Kant sort of famously says is the common root of sensibility and understanding. And so early on, Hegel's position is that Kant had come so close to thinking the right thought with the notion of transcendental imagination, which was really a theory of the unity of the faculties, which essentially would have, you know, first you'd get an account of the inseparability concept and intuition. Can't have any intuitions without concepts, no concepts without intuitions. But Hegel also thought that this was really a way to get beyond a kind of understanding of forms of thought as an imposition onto an exogenous material, a thing in itself. Mm-hmm. So that was the sort of early position. But when you get to like 1807, like phenomenology, and especially when we get to the logic proper, it's especially in the logic. I mean, Hegel pretty much he kind of just abandons the faculty critique. I mean, he's not really is interested in a critique of Kant's faculties, and I mean, he refers to it as like as a soul bag in one of the texts that Kant is this bag of faculties or whatever. And really, what Hegel's interested in instead is, as he puts the point that like, there are sort of two main criticisms that he makes of Kant, like around the minor and the greater logics, and those two criticisms are something like, that first, Kant remains a subjectivist and an impositionist because he thinks that categories and forms of sensibility. Sorry, there's a fire truck coming by.
It's funny, like the algorithm is so good that it just like takes out everything. In my conversation with Justin, like there's like a jackhammer going on. I guess there's like construction behind him the entire time, and I didn't hear a thing.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. So the first critique is that Hegel's first critique of Kant is that Kant's a subjectivist and impositionist, which means that Kant thinks that sensibility and understanding always come in a package. And because the categories of the understanding must always be relativized to some form of sensibility, he thinks that that means that our categories will always be alien to things in themselves, that we can never have access to things in themselves. And the second criticism is that that Kant just sort of accepts his categories and the forms of judgment, that he just takes the categories from Aristotle. He doesn't really subject them to any kind of rigorous deduction. He just inherits them from Aristotle without any further question. And what Hegel tries to do in the logic is to show that, well, actually, the task isn't to take up a set of categories and then ask whether or not they apply to the world. That's the wrong question. The question is to ask whether or not the categories themselves are true. So we have to examine the categories and actually ask whether they themselves internally make sense. And if you can do that, if you can ask whether the categories themselves make sense, Hegel thinks that this is the way to get a rigorous account of how things must be and to overcome the sort of problem of the thing in itself. So we move away from a category theory and a faculty theory where you're presupposing a kind of subjective experience, and then asking what, are the conditions under which that experience is possible, namely the conditions under which the categories can apply to intuitions, and instead posing the question, well, which categories are actually true? What is a true category? And that kind of is what structures, his logical inquiry. Um, so that was a long-winded answer, but basically, Hegel is committed to this distinction between understanding and reason, Verstand and Vernunft, but it looks very different in his thought from the way that it looks in Kant. Where in Kant, reason is, it's a higher order sort of, it's the faculty of inference, but you don't really have exactly the same hierarchy between understanding and reason that you get in Hegel, where Hegel wants to say that understanding basically corresponds to, our commonsensical ways of making sense of things versus reason, which articulates the more fundamental speculative structures that, ground knowledge and being as such, or something like that. And then there was a final question that you
Yeah.
raised, which I'm now
Well,
trying to.
well, like, so yeah, let me segue into that. So, like, to ask this kind of like a ham-fisted question, like a kind of little kid asking why is the sky blue or whatever. But like, so like, would that mean that like at a certain horizon of intelligibility, be on the way to absolute knowing, that there wouldn't even be a distinction as primordial as that between like data coming in and processing that data?
That's exactly, yeah, yeah, because Hegel wants to say that very distinction, that already presupposes that there's something outside of the categories to which the categories are being applied. Whereas his point is that, you know, no, we're actually going to give an account of what the forms of any possible sense data could even be. Like what must be true of any sense data for it to be sense data. And that's sort of a and so in that sense, I mean, another way to sort of put it, which is a little bit it's kind of a shibboleth, but yeah, I mean, Hegel basically wants to say that there is no such thing as a thing in itself. I mean, we just are giving
Yeah,
an
sure.
account,
Yeah.
to speak. Yeah,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like that's yeah. It's like I feel like it's a fairly well-known, critique, like his critique of Kant, that Kant was sort of
yeah.
reifying the thing in itself by positing it as unknowable. Um. Uh. So then, okay. So then, with uh, like, hmm. There's kind of two sides of this. So just so back to like a politics question, basically. Oh, and also maybe bringing in, like it'd be fun to discuss a little bit, um, my drama on Twitter, that you engaged in a little bit, right? That I was kind of getting,
Oh
uh,
yeah, yeah. Right, right.
criticized. I think I was, so I was on tour and was kind of tweeting mostly about Christianity, or I don't know exactly what it was that people didn't like, but that like like I view my praxis as um radical, uh and but it's it's confrontational in a way that then gets criticized as being fascist, basically. Like people kept calling me a Christo fascist. I don't even know what that is, right? But like and part of that is because of overtly talking about religion in a way that uh is triggering to people. But maybe there's more to it than that. I mean, um like it could be that to some degree we are in an era where um you know any thought that is truly radical will be neutralized by the liberal order by being called reactionary. And then it gets lumped in with thought like, say, John the Hegelian, that is actually reactionary.
Yeah,
And so there's this kind of like uncomfortable place that I find myself in, where like, I end up kind of feeling temporarily, like more of an ally with like reactionaries, and then getting to know them better and sort of realizing how actually like hateful they are. um, and but so like on the topic of the radical and the liberal and communism, uh, like I mean, they kind of wander around the question a bit. Like there's also, like I mentioned, post-humanism, I mentioned
Yeah, right.
uh and also like the role, like some, I would say, like on the surface, most like tankies online and even probably most like DSA Marxists imagine communism as like ideally we would like stop capitalism now, or something, and like and and distribute the means of production, and like that kind of thing. Whereas there's like a version of Marxism that is perhaps more right wing, actually, which is the kind of let capitalism like fully realize the means of production, and
Yeah,
then get to a point where maybe it just kind of naturally, you know like we have nuclear fusion or something, and it just kind of naturally the communist situation that we all, I think everyone agrees is like a good idea, just kind of happens. Or maybe there's a moment of truth where the technology is there, but there's this question, this real possibility that it'll all be in the hands of a
yeah,
couple of capitalists that put us in the matrix, or there's a moment to really seize the means of production. But it's not here yet. It's going to be here, I mean, at this point probably in like 2 years or something. But so like um um yeah, so what are your thoughts on how radical you want your Marxism and communism to be? How radical can it be for Hegel? And just like maybe just the language of left versus right. I kind of like this idea of like calling myself post-right, which is like I know
right.
that it secretly means leftist, but it's just kind of like, okay, fine, call me right wing, like, I because I do believe in actually like discipline and like there are certain conservative values that I think like the leftist should have. So fine, call it right wing. But um
Right. Right. I mean, I think that the two positions that you just sketched, I mean, in a way that to me seems to be a perfect like formulation of an antinomy between a voluntarism and a determinism, where on the one hand, like we need communism tomorrow, and that ends up actually being like quite a rearguard, like redistributivist vision of some sort, like the DSA type thing. Or on the other hand, you have like just feel like, well, we just need to let capitalism sort of we just need to let the contradiction complete itself, or we just need to let the means of production, the forces of production, perfect themselves to such an extent that like that seems to me to be basically a form of determinism. Um, and I guess my view would be that, I mean, the tradition that I still, uh, in some ways, identify the most with is the Lukashian, Leninist, uh, sort of view where you need a strong form of like party politics. Need to have like a robust organizational form. The sort of the changes aren't just going to create themselves, but also you need some way of mediating between Marxist theory and actual revolutionary actors. And I think that that's the sort of classic sort of Leninist vision remains really important in that respect, even if in some other respects it's like kind of impossible to imagine such a thing right now. So, I mean, on this score, I mean, I think that the kind of Adornian model of criticizing or illuminating like the lack of possibilities, actually undertaking a critique of present forms of, leftism, that is one way to sort of hold open the door for some, more robust form of emancipatory politics, when and if such opportunities should present themselves. I mean, that's very meager. It's not much, but it's also, I think, like, you know, I don't think that there's much else that can be done, and I think it's diluted if we act as if we can just sort of force the issue, or if we just wait around for long enough, it will just happen. So I think we're kind of like in an antinomian situation historically. And as for like Hegel's role in this, I mean, I think that, you know, like the reason that I often get attacked on Twitter, or that the Hegel stuff gets attacked, is because yes, there is this, whether it's characterized as right wing or whatever, there's this idea that, well, like Hegel has this sort of bullshit teleological story he wants to tell about rational self-realization, and this is justifying all of these horrible things that have happened historically, and this is like a just so story that's depriving us of our agency, blah blah blah. And I mean, part of like what I've been trying to do, like publicly, I guess, or on Twitter, is to show that this is not really what the account is. This is not really what Hegel's arguing. And if we really do think seriously through the kinds of arguments that Hegel is making, then I think that like Hegel is actually articulating certain conceptual constraints that have to be in place for an emancipatory politics to truly be emancipatory. And like some of those constraints, consist in, having a certain way of thinking about agency and self-determination. Some of those constraints have to do with how we think about history and how we justify our historical ideals, how we justify, socialism or communism. And I think all that is compatible with, at the same time, undertaking like a totally ruthless critique of those aspects of Hegel's own thought, where like, like, yeah, we read the philosophy of right, and Hegel talks about like a strict, gender-based division of labor. And these are the sorts of things that Right Hegelian and his group of people, they wanted to affirm, that we kind of need this, that these very traditionalist, elements that you can find in certain aspects of Hegel, they take this sort of stuff to be on the money. Whereas I think what we actually need to do is to look at how those are elements that actually fall below Hegel's own very high bar of rationality. And those are points at which we can say that, if we actually, take Hegel seriously and take him at his own thought, then these are elements that we have to go beyond. So I mean, maybe one way to put the point is that if one is as consistently Hegelian as one can be, then there is nothing else to be than to be a Marxist. Because that just is, in my view, like the only way to like own up to the rationality inherent in Hegel's own thought.